All right, Shabbos, say good morning. A lot to do today. Beautiful daf ahead of us today. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Justin, and Abigail Rosemore, for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this month in memory of their beloved son, Kobi Chaim Yaakov David, Zichron Levracha ben Yosef Tzadok. To thank our monthly Talmud Torah sponsor, Alan and Sumarowitz and family, Jason, Deborah, Justin, Rebecca, Mindy, Simcha, and all of the grandchildren, and the merit of our Refuah Shlema for Sue, Shulam Tova, Bas Mindel. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Adam and Allison Steinmetz and Shari and Alan Steinmetz, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushes this week in memory of Harriet Steinmetz, Chaya Bas Meir Zichron Levracha, on the occasion of our 4th yard site. And we thank our Day of Learning sponsors, again, Alan and Sue Marowitz, for dedicating all of the learning today in memory of Sue's father, Nathaniel Funeral, Nosson ben Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi, Zichron Livracha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah's Neshama will have an aliyah and his family a nechama. And Abosai, with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Tzadik Hey 95, and we are picking up on 94b, Tzadik Dalad Amud Beis. And we're picking up in the second wide line. It is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. Saros. Remember again, the Mishnah spoke about the idea that halacha l'maaseh, if you pull hair out of your head or out of your mustache or out of your beard, so Rabbi Eliezer holds that you're chayiv, but the Chachamim say that it's only asr midirabana. So let's analyze. Says the Gemara Tana, Hanota male piazog chayiv. If you take literally a scissors, if you cut a scissors full amount of hair on Shabbos, you will be chayiv. V'kama male piazog. We'll say how much is a scissor full? Rabbi Yehuda says 2 hairs. 2 hairs. I v'hatanya ula karcha shtayim. But I will say also the Brisa says that for karcha, and I will say karcha means that halacha l'maaseh you're not permitted to actively cause yourself to have a bald spot by pulling out your hair. Now remember again, what does that refer to? That refers to certain biblical mourning practices that they had, that the Torah says one is not permitted to do so. So it says for karcha, you're not allowed to pull out 2 hairs. So it sounds like the shear for karcha is 2 hairs, but that's not the shear for Shabbos. Ema v'chein lekarcha shtayim. Say it's also for karcha. In other words, in addition, ultimately again, to Shabbos, the shear for karcha is the same 2 hairs. Tanya Namachir that supports this. Hanolta mali piazog b'Shabbos chayiv. If a person cuts off, right, literally a scissors worth amount of hair on Shabbos, they're going to be chayiv. V'kama mali piazog. How much is a scissors worth of hair? Shtayim, 2 hairs. Rabbi Eliezer Omer achos. Rabbi Eliezer says even 1 hair. Umodim chacham Rabbi Eliezer b'melakit lavanas misok shchoros. So we'll say, but the chachamim agree that if someone dafka is pulling out his white hairs amongst his dark hairs, that einachinami you'll be chayiv even for pulling out 1 hair. Sha'afilu achas chayiv, that chayiv even for 1. Rashi points out, why would that be? If the shear is 2 hairs, so why is it that if I'm pulling out 1 hair, right, and it's a white hair amongst my dark hairs, that I'm chayiv for 1? Very simple. 2 is a din in chashivos. We assume that 2 hairs is the most basic unit of chashivos. But if a person dafka is targeting his white hairs, it's because he doesn't want to look old. And lemais at the end of the day, then it turns out that the white hair, that 1 hair, is also going to be chashiv. V'davar zeh, both is actually incredible. V'davar zeh, this practice of pulling out white hairs, af bechol aser, is actually not just aser on Shabbos, but it's also aser during the week. Why? Mishum shenemar lo yilbash gever simlas isha. Because we'll say this falls under the prohibition of a man not wearing the clothing of women. So we'll say, remember again, there's a halacha against cross-dressing, right? Cross-dressing and Issa D'Oraisa. Interestingly enough, the only exception to this rule, fascinatingly enough, is Purim, right? So Purim, which is a Torah in and of itself, Purim cross-dressing is permitted. I'm not saying encouraged. I'm saying Lamaisa, it's permitted, right? But Lamaisa during the rest of the year, halacha Lamaisa is an Issa D'Oraisa. It's an Issa D'Oraisa. So therefore, again, the Gemara says that the act of going. So interestingly enough, the biblical prohibition of cross-dressing is kind of expanded to include anything, any practice that is considered to be purely feminine in nature. So interestingly enough, at least from a Talmudic perspective, the notion of dyeing one's hair, a man, right, or the notion of removing white hair was considered to be something that was purely feminine in nature, and therefore if a person were to do this, Chazal felt, the Gemara felt, that would be in violation ultimately of lo yilbash ger simlas isha, of engaging in practices that are purely feminine. Okay, interesting. Again, it's fascinating to see in general whether those types of halachas, change again depending on what's acceptable with the times. Okay, Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, again, let me clarify that. Not the cross-dressing, Rabbi Shimon. I mean, like in terms of the notion of like what's considered to be acceptable, male behavior versus feminine behavior is really, really quite fascinating. Anyway, the Gemara says as follows, not our topic. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, Siporin Shapir Shor. So says, therefore we see that the Doraisa is the removal of 2 hairs. That's a Doraisa. And I remember again, I want to point out that's dafka if you do it bekli. As you saw it in yesterday's daf, if you pull out hairs by hand, whether that be from your head, from your mustache, from your beard, so halacha lamaisa, then it's only chayiv midrabanan. Same idea with cutting nails. You cut nails with a utensil, it could be chayiv doraisa, right? You go ahead and you bite your nails. So ultimately, again, that'll be an isser dirabanan. Tanya, Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, Tziporin Shapir Shuba, Vitzitzin Shapir Shuruba. And so it's very interesting. Rav Shimon says as follows: what happens if you have a nail? Tziporin is a nail. Tzitzin are cuticles. So if you have a nail or a cuticle that is almost fully detached. So what's the halacha? Biyad mutter. You could tear it off, right? The nail or the cuticle with your hand. If you do that, it's mutter. Bikli chayiv chatos. But if you do it with the utensil, it's an iser daraisa and you be chayiv chatos. The Gemara says, what? Mi'ika midi de bekli chayiv chatos biyad mutter. Is there such a thing like this? That ultimately, again, if you use the utensil, it's an iser daraisa, but if you do it with your hand, it's mutter lechatchila. Or as Rabbi say, there seems to be like missing a step there, right? In other words, we don't usually go from like iser daraisa to mutter lechatchila. Generally, there's like a step in between over there, like asr midaraisa and mutter midaraisa, but asr midirabanan, and then the next step after that is mutter lechatchila. So it's interesting. If you tell me if I have a nail that is almost majority detached, if I pull it up with my hand, it's mutter lechatchila. But if I go ahead and I remove it with a kli, it's an isser daraisa. So the Gemara says, is that true? Hachikam, this is what it means to see. Say, pirshu ruban. So ultimately, again, if the majority of the nail or the cuticle has separated from the finger, mutter. So biyad mutter. So ultimately, again, one could remove it by hand. Bikli pater aval aser. But ultimately, with the utensil, it is aser midirabanan. Right. So even though again, I will say, so obviously, the logic behind this is that once the nail or the utensil is majority detached, anything that is majority detached generally is considered to be detached. We go after the roof. So if the majority of it is detached from the body, it's going to be detached. Therefore, the act of removing it, let's say you have a nail, you bite it off, so that's mutter. With the kli, with the utensil, so it's asr midirabanan. For the simple reason, in general, just Chazal did not want you using these utensils on Shabbos. That's the idea. We don't want you using a nail clipper. We don't want you using scissors. So lo pirshu. However, what happens if the majority of the nail or the cuticle was not detached? So then biyad patra aval aser. If you do it with your hand, it's asr midrabanan. Supposedly, because remember again, any time you remove a nail or a cuticle with your mouth, biting it, or with your hand, that's always going to be, that'll never be an isur d'oraisa. Most that's an isur d'rabanan. However, bekli chayiv chata. So we'll say in that case, if the nail or the cuticle is majority attached and you remove it with the utensil, that indeed is an isur d'oraisa. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, halacha k'Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Yehuda says that in fact the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So we'll say that indeed the halacha would be that if the nail is majority detached, then ultimately again one would be permitted to go ahead and remove it with their mouth or with their hand, but with a clear be aser midirabanan. But if it's majority attached, if one removes it with his hand or with his mouth, it is an isur d'rabanan, but with a kli, it'll be an isur d'oraisa. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'hu shepirshu klape malo umitzaras oso. Rabbi said that is only assuming that what? That is only assuming that lamaisa, the nail or the cuticle, becomes attached at the fingertip and is peeling downwards. that's considered to cause a person discomfort. In other words, the license to remove a nail or a cuticle, the assumption is that it's causing one discomfort. So that's when you're permitted to go ahead and do it if the majority is detached. Then you could remove it ultimately with your mouth or with your hand. But lamaisa, again, that's assuming that it's peeling back from the top of the finger down, in which case, again, it causes a person discomfort. Good. V'chein hagodeles. So we'll say, so remember again, the Mishnah then spoke about, literally translated, godeles is braiding hair, kocheles is applying eye makeup, and pokeses, Rashi points out in the Mishnah that pokeses ultimately, again, is combing hair, or as we're going to see, lav dafka has to be with a comb, but it's separating hair by a woman. It's separating hair. So the Gemara says as follows. What's very interesting? Godeles, kocheles, pokeses, mishum mai mechayva. What exactly is the problem with godeles, kocheles, and pokeses? What's wrong with these actions on Shabbos? So this is very interesting. I'm Rabbi Abin, I'm Rabbi Yossi, I'm Berachanina. Godeles, mishum oreges. So braiding on Shabbos, braiding hair, is a problem of weaving. Kocheles, applying eye makeup, mishum koseves, is a problem of writing. Pokeses, combing or separating hair, mishum tove, is because of weaving. Now Rashi points out over here how is this weaving? Rashi says shemitakenes sara bin etzbaoseh uposhanteto kishu nichrach. So apparently I'm going to say just like by weaving, you have to separate out the threads. So too if a person runs a comb through their hair or their fingers so they're separating out the hairs, that's ultimately again a problem of weaving. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. So Amruk Rabbana Kamed Rabbi Avo, V'chi derech ariga bekach, V'chi derech ksiva bekach, V'chi derech tvia bekach. I will say, here's the problem. In general, to be chayev for a malacha, you must do it in the normative way. So is this the way that people ultimately weave? Is braiding like weaving? Is ultimately applying eye makeup ultimately again like writing? Is combing out your hair like spinning wool? Doesn't make sense. Rather, Rabbi Avo says as follows. I learned the following. Top of Tzaddik Kocheles mishum sovas. In general, if you apply eye makeup, that is problematic ultimately because of dyeing. Pokeses mishum bona. Ultimately again, and pokeses, right, going ahead and pokeses will be a problem ultimately of building. So the Gemara says again, v'chi derech binyan bekach. I don't understand, but is this the derech? Godeles upokeses mishum bona. Braiding and separating hair is a problem because of binyan, because of building. So we'll say, so apparently what you would normally do is before braiding the hair, a woman would separate the hair and then she would braid. The act of braiding is in and of itself an act of building. So the Gemara says, what? Is that derech binyan? Abba said, listen to how beautiful this Gemara is. This is incredible. Kididarish Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. As Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya said, Vayiven Hashem Elokim es hatzela. So let's remember again, this is by the creation of Chava. So what happens? It says, Vayiven Hashem Elokim es hatzela. Kadosh Baruch Hu built the rib. Tzela is the rib. The Moshe built the rib of Adam and made Chava out of it. So the Gemara darshans something else. Melamed Shekila Kadosh Baruch Hu lechava v'avia eitzel Adam. We'll say this is so beautiful that before HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought Chava to Adam, what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? The Ribono Shel Olam braided her hair. We'll say, can you imagine the incredible beauty? And say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted Chava to look beautiful for Adam. So what does he do before he introduces, before they meet each other, because remember again, Adam was asleep when HaKadosh Baruch Hu took the rib from him and fashioned Chava. So before the Ribono Shel Olam brought Chava to meet Adam, he braided her hair. He braided her hair. I will say, now, it's just so beautiful. This is how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us. The Ribono Shel Olam loves us like a father who braids the hair of his daughter, like the father who takes care of his children, who he loves so much. This is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for Chava. So the Gemara says, and the Torah uses the lashon of vayiven. He built. So the Gemara says, Shekem b'krachayim korin l'kelisa benisa, because in the outlying islands they call braiding building. So Rabbi said, the Gemara is suggesting over there that the act of braiding hair is in fact an issue of building. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, Godeles kocheles upokesses liatzma ptura lechaverta chayeves. Well, it's another interesting statement. Shimon Elazar says that if you go ahead and you braid hair or apply eye makeup or comb out hair, if you do it for yourself, you are pater, but if you do it for your friend, you are chayiv. Now, what's the pshat? Rashi says, Tap Rashi, Tzadik Hemad Aleph, li'atzma ptura she'eni yechola livnos yafa ve'in derech binyan ele isha lechavertas. This is interesting. In general, I guess the Gemara is saying is a person can't braid their own hair very well, or for that matter, apply their own eye makeup perfectly, or even comb out their own hair. So if you do it for yourself, you're pater, but if you do it for someone else, that's when you're going to be chayiv. V'chein hayir Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer. Isha lo savir srak al paneh. We'll say another associated halacha. A woman should not apply srak. Now we'll say if you look at Rashi, srak, tseva adom, like a red dye, like blush. Tseva adom hu abba b'kanim shukam fine. A woman shouldn't go ahead and apply this on Shabbos. Why? Mipnei shetzova. So we'll say this in general. So you see, you get into over here the issue of applying makeup on Shabbos. So what's the problem with makeup on Shabbos? So there could be a couple of different issues regarding makeup on Shabbos. It could be mamachik, it could be smoothing, but it could also be an issue, as you see over here, of tzovas, of dyeing, right? Anytime you add coloration to something on Shabbos, you could run into an issue ultimately again of dyeing, of tzovea. So therefore, a woman can't apply blush on Shabbos because you run into an issue of tzovea. Tan Rabbanan, the Raisa taught as follows. HaCholiv was another fascinating Gemara. HaCholiv v'hamechabet v'hamegavein ki grogeres. Suppose listen to this. If a person goes that now choliv means milking an animal. Mechabet. Now look at Rashi. This is actually very interesting. Mechabet hamamit hacholav bekeva v'lianira mechabet osek min kli gemi v'nosin hakafui b'socho umecholav shenisube notfin v'lozan. So suppose say so. Mechabet is actually where you take like the thicker milk, you put it like into like a cloth, which acts like a sieve, and you allow the liquid to drip out, and the thicker masses ultimately again to remain behind. I'm sure there's a more technical term for that. So the Gemara says mechabetz. Megabin is the act of making cheese. Cheese making. So what's the halacha? So ultimately again, kigro geres. If you do this in the amount of a grogeres, or you're going to be chayiv on Shabbos, as we'll discuss. Similarly, hamechabet, one who sweeps his house, mirabet. Now, both say mirabet was they used to have dirt floors. So what you would do on a dirt floor is you would sprinkle the floor with water so that the dust wouldn't rise. So doing this on Shabbos is going to be aser. V'harod chalos dvash, or one who goes there and crushes honeycombs, right? Rod chalos dvash is crushing a honeycomb. If you do these things on Shabbos, shagag b'Shabbos chayiv chatos. If you did any of these actions inadvertently, you will be chayiv midoraisa, chayiv chatos. Hezid b'yom tov lo ke'arboim. And if you did it intentionally, then of course, again, remember, intentionally on Shabbos will be an iser doraisa, and on Yom Tov, you'll get malchus. Teve Rabbi Eliezer. The Chacham say, echad zeh v'echad zeh, eino ela mishum Shabbos. The Chacham say, no. Everything mentioned over here is only an iser midrabanan. So we'll say, so let's analyze this. So Rashi says, echad zeh v'echad zeh, whether it's Shabbos or Yom Tov, it's only going to be an iser d'Rabbanan. So we'll say now we're going to go back and analyze each of these things. So many different actions were just mentioned over here. Nachem bar Guya, supposed to be really fascinating. Nachem bar Guya, Ikol Narda. So Nachem bar Guya went to Naharda. So what happened? Ba'umine cholev mishum mai mechayiv. So they asked him. Nachem bar Guya shows up in Naharda, scholar in residence, and they say to him, "No, why is it usher to milk an animal on Shabbos? Cholev mishum mai." Amar mishum cholev. It's also because of milking. Nechabit mishum mai mechayiv. And why is it problematic to go ahead and pour the milk through a sieve or through some type of cloth to separate out the liquid from the more solid pieces? Mishum mai mechayiv. Amar mishum mechabetz. It's chayiv because of mechabetz. Okay. Megabed mishum mai chayiv. Tell us, Reb Nachman. Right. Ultimately, again, why are you chayiv for making cheese on Shabbos? Amar lahem mishum megabein. It's usher because of making cheese. So what's this? You see what just happened? They asked Reb Nachman, Why is this asr? So he said because, right? Why is it asr to milk? Because it's asr to milk. Why is it asr to go ahead and pour the milk through a cloth? Because it's asr to pour milk through a cloth. Why is it asr to make cheese? Because it's asr to make cheese. Amrulay, they said to Rab Nachman, Rabcha katal kani ba'ag mahava. Your Rebbe must have been a reed cutter in a swamp. And I was saying, now that's one of those things. It reads much better in the Aramaic than it does in the translated form. But apparently, that's the way you really gave a shtach to someone's Rebbe, right? Your Rebbe, right? It's not like today you'd say like, your Rebbe, whatever, right? But your Rebbe was a reed cutter in a swamp. That's what happened. So they said, John Achman, what are you talking about? Like we asked you a shaila, and you're just simply telling us what we already knew. So Amrulay. Also, Shal Bei Midrasha. So he went, right? So Rav Nachman himself, now both say, so interestingly enough, what the Gemara is telling us is that Rav Nachman had learned that all three of these actions are Asur on Shabbos, but apparently he did not learn or he was not taught why they were Asur on Shabbos, right? He didn't teach that. So the Gemara says, also Shal Bei Midrasha. He went and he asked in the base medrash. So he said, Amrulay. So I said to him, okay, I'll tell you why. Cholev. We'll say milking an animal on Shabbos ultimately again is going to be problematic because of mefarik. Rashi says mefarik, kimo mefarik masui sheporek ochal mimakom shnis kasev. Habi told us dash. So remember again, there is an av melacha called dash. Dash is threshing. Dash is threshing. Threshing is the separation of the wheat from the chaff, which we'll say for us we better know as the melacha of borer. So whenever you extract something from something else, ultimately, again, that is the malacha of dash. So the milk is absorbed in the animal. When you extract the milk from the animal, that is the malacha of dash, the malacha of mefarik, extracting something from something else. So now I do want to point out again, this is talking about again when you want the milk. There's a different halacha when the animal itself must express milk in order that the animal is not a bitzar. So there are ways to alleviate that on Shabbos, because sometimes, again, just like a human being, just like a mother, even if the child doesn't want to nurse, the mother sometimes has to express milk to go ahead and alleviate pain. So same idea by the animals. Again, the issue is milking the animal ultimately, again, and for you to benefit from it. But there are ways for the animal to express milk to alleviate its pain. But again, that's not our sugya. But ultimately, again, milking of the animal, the issue over here is the malacha of dash, of threshing, mefarik. Mechabetz, what's the problem ultimately again with the passing the milk through the cloth? Mishum borer. Okay, so that was an easy one. That one we knew, right? Because the whole point of the cloth is to allow the liquid through and to keep the solid pieces behind. Negabin, very interesting. What's wrong with making cheese on Shabbos? Chayiv mishum bona. So it's really quite interesting, right? Ultimately, the issue of making cheese on Shabbos is one of bona, one of building. The idea that you're taking liquid and ultimately, again, building it into a solid mass is an issue of building. Now, obviously, this is not the Isser D'Oraisa, this is the Isser D'Rabbanan, but an Isser nevertheless. Pretty incredible. So what's wrong with Mechabed Merabed Tzuro Dechalos Dvash? So we'll say, remember again, let's go back. Sweeping. Mechabed is sweeping. Merabed is sprinkling water on the floor to keep the dust down. Ro Dechalos Dvash means, again, crushing the honeycombs. And we'll say, now the idea over there, obviously, of crushing the honeycombs is to extract the honey. So what's the halacha? Shagog b'Shabbos chayiv chatos. If you did this intentionally on Shabbos, if you did it unintentionally on Shabbos, you chayiv chatos. Hezid b'Yom Tov, but if you did it intentionally on Yom Tov, ultimately again loke arbam, you'll get malchus. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Amar Rabbi Lazar, my time with Rabbi Eliezer. What's Rabbi Eliezer's logic? T'chsiv vayitbol osa b'yaras hadvash, He dipped his staff. Ultimately, again, I will say in Yaros Hadvash. Now, this is actually very interesting. So remember, again, this is the story in Shmuel Aleph, where, again, Yonah's son Shaul, they're going ahead and they're at war, and Shaul says that whoever eats anything before we vanquish the enemy, ultimately, again, will be killed. Yonah's son did not know, right, the decree of his father, so he went ahead and he immersed his staff Biyaros Dvash. Now the Gemara is intrigued over here. I don't understand why does the Navi call? I mean, b'pashtus, Yonasan went ahead and stuck his staff in a honeycomb, right? In a honeycomb. That's how he picked up. That's how he picked up the. That's how he picked up the dvash. So why is it ultimately again that the Torah that the Navi is referring to Ya'aros dvash? Why does it refer to it as a forest? So the Gemara says, "Elolomer lecha ma ya'ar hatol shemena b'Shabbos chayiv," just like a forest. If someone picks something from the forest, they're chayiv on Shabbos. Now, both remember again, if you pick something in the forest, you're chayiv because of the melach of kotzer. Olker davar mimakom gidulo. You cannot pick something on Shabbos in a place where it grows. Af chalos devash harodim ena b'Shabbos chayiv chata. So too again, if you go ahead and you take honey, on Shabbos, right from the honeycomb, ultimately again you'll be chayiv echatos. That's Rabbi Eliezer's position. Ameimar, so Ameimar goes on. He says as follows: Ameimar shara zilcha b'mechuza. So let's listen to this. Ameimar allowed for the sprinkle. So I just want to point out everyone is agreeing that halacha l'maisa, the act of crushing the honeycomb in order to go ahead and get honey from it on Shabbos ultimately again will be aser. The shaila just is what's the nature, right? What's the nature of the iser? Is it an iser d'oraisa, or ultimately again is it according to, like the Chachamim say, it's an iser d'Rabbanan? So again, we pass that it's only going to be an iser d'Rabbanan, and the truth is again the nature of that iser is somewhat subject to dispute. B'Pashtus, we don't really accept Rabbi Eliezer's position that it's about the comparison ultimately again to the forest, but it could be a potential issue of borer as well. So the Gemara goes weiter. Ameimar shara zilcha b'mechuza. So we'll say Ameimar in the city of Mechuza allowed them to sprinkle water on the floor in order to keep the dust down. Why? Amar taimamai amar Rabbanan. So we'll say, why is it that in general the Rabbanan did not allow both sweeping as well as sprinkling water? Dilma asi la'ashvuye gumos. We'll say, here we go. What's the issue ultimately again of sprinkling water or sweeping for that matter? There was a concern that people may come to flatten out their floors. I was supposed to remember again, people have dirt floors. So when you have dirt floors, it's not flat. So people may come to go ahead and flatten it out. If you're already sweeping, you might as well just go ahead and just sweep a little bit more, flatten out the floor. Or if you're already sprinkling water, keeping the dust down, you may just flatten it out. But also remember again, we learned before that halacha l'maisa, the act of flattening earth, what are you chayiv for? It depends, right? If it's in the field, then it's zorea, it's seeding, right? Or chorish or charish or plant, but pashta zriya, anything that you do to ready the ground, ultimately again for planting is problematic. Inside the home, it's bona, it's building. So that was the concern. Chazal said, we don't want you sweeping your floors, nor do we want you putting water to keep the dust down because of bona. But ultimately, Ameimar said apparently in Mechuza, they didn't have dirt floors. So because they didn't have dirt floors, therefore again, Ameimar said that the Gzeira doesn't apply. Rava Tosfa Ashkechel Ravina de Kamitzar Mehavla. Rava Tosfa found Ravina Bosei was suffering from dust inhalation. Bosei, the idea is that in his house or wherever he was, people are walking around, and when you walk around, they kicked up dust. And I guess again it caused breathing problems for him. Did you not, does the master not hold to the following halacha? We learned in our Brayso. So what's interesting? Let's say you want to go ahead and you want to throw water down on the ground to keep the dust down, but you have a home that has a dirt floor. So remember again, what we're beginning to see is this rabbinic prohibition of not being allowed to go ahead and put water on the dirt floor or on the floor on Shabbos is dafka a din in dirt floors. It's a din in dirt floor. So what happens if you have a dirt floor, but you want to be able to put water down? What can you do? Listen to this. Maybe areva malaya mayim v'rochitz panav bezavizu, yada bezavizu, ragla bezavizu. V'nimtza ba'is misrabetz me'elov. So listen to this. It's a great eitzah. So if you have a dirt floor, but you need to put water down on the floor, but you're not allowed to put water down on the floor. So what do? Bring a basin of water, wash your face in this corner, wash your hands in this corner, and wash your feet in this corner. We'll say, what happens when you wash your hand? What happens when you wash from a basin? Inevitably, water sprinkles on the floor. So like this, you're doing something permitted, but the byproduct of it is that some water gets on the ground. So ultimately, again, the Gemara is suggesting that would be permitted. I'm really lava that I said, I never heard this. Good eitzah. Tana. Isha chachma marbetzes beisa b'Shabbos. A smart woman knows how to sprinkle water on her floor on Shabbos. Rashi points out, what does that mean? Eishes chachma, isha chachma, eishes talmid chacham, abas talmid chacham, sheshah me'aviyah. So either the wife of Talmud Chacham or the daughter of a Talmud Chacham will know the following Eitzah. Marbetzes Beisar, Rashi says, Rochetzes kitonios b'zavizu, the kosas b'zavizu. Same idea. When she washes the dishes, she'll wash the plates in one corner, the cups in a different corner. It's the same Eitzah as the washing your hands, your face, and your feet. Which is what? Which is that halach l'maisa. Whenever you wash from a basin, some water is always going to sprinkle. And what? It'll inevitably get on the floor. And halach l'maisa go ahead and cause the earth to remain, or cause the dirt to remain settled. So the Gemara says, Va'idna, the Srilanka Rabbi Shimon, but Rabbi say, now that we hold like Rabbi Shimon. Now what does Rabbi Shimon say? Rabbi Shimon says, Davar she'ino miskavein is mutter, that if you do something, but you don't have kavanah for the malacha, that ultimately, again, it is mutter. Therefore, what? Shari afil lechatchila. This practice of sprinkling water on the dirt floor is mutter even lechatchila. Because remember, again, according to Rabbi Shimon, if you sprinkle water, but your intention is not to level out any floor, your intention, mamish, is just to go ahead and keep the dust down. Even if some of the gumos, some of the depressions do get flattened out, that is not your intention. And Rabbi Shimon holds that a davar she'ino miskavein is totally mutter. Shabbos say, interestingly enough, this is very halacha l'maisa, because many of us do sweep, not as much as sprinkling of the water, but sweeping. Right? The Gemara doesn't talk about sweeping as much, because sweeping is much more obvious that it was problematic. Because when you sweep and you have a dirt floor, you mamish are changing the, we'll call it topography, right? You are changing the topography of your household floor. That's why the Aruch HaShulchan points out that this halacha no longer applies in cities where the majority of the residents don't have dirt floors. So if the majority of the residents of the city don't have dirt floors, then halacha l'maisa, one would be permitted to sweep on Shabbos, which is why we in fact sweep on Shabbos. Pretty amazing. Says the Mishnah, Hatolish me otzitz, nakov chayiv, v'she'eno nakov pater, Rabbi Shimon poter bazeh bazeh. Supposed to listen to this. Otzitz nakov. Otzitz nakov is a perforated flower pot. So we'll say, remember again, this is an ongoing machlokes throughout Shas. It feels like, I don't know if this is true, but it feels like in every Masechta, somehow otzitz nakov, right? The perforated flower pots. For many of us, this perforated flower pot has been following us since our yeshiva days. Right? We can't dodge the perforated flower pot. It's everywhere and anywhere. So the Gemara says, what happens? So remember, the yesodistic machlokes is, if you have a perforated flower pot, so the shaila is, does the perforation allow for the contents of the pot to remain connected to the ground or not? So that's the fundamental machlokes that is everywhere. So the Gemara says, if on Shabbos, I have a perforated, so we'll say, I have a potted plant, I have a potted tomato plant, and it happens to be in a perforated flower pot that sits on the ground. So what's the halacha? The Mishnah says, Hatolish me otzitz nakov chayiv. If I pick a tomato from my potted tomato plant, but the potted tomato plant has a hole on the bottom and it's sitting on the earth, I'm chayiv for kotzer. I'm chayiv midoraisa for an act of detaching something from the ground. V'she'eno nakov, but again, if it's a potted plant that is not perforated, then enachinami, that is considered to be detached from the ground, and therefore halacha l'maisa, I would not be chayiv. For Reb Shimon or Reb Shimon poter bazeh, Reb Shimon says either way, halacha l'maisa. So whether it's otzitz nakov, otzitz she'eno nakov, if it's a potted plant, it is not considered to be attached to the ground. Says the Gemara, Rami le Abaye l'Rava. So Abaye raised the kasha to Rava. Rami le Reb Chia barav l'Rav. Amre le Reb Chia barav l'Rav. Tanan. We learned Reb Shimon poter bazeh. Right? We learned in our Mishnah. Reb Shimon says that whatever type of potted plant, whether it's perforated or not perforated, it's considered to be detached. Alma nakov l'Reb Shimon kishe'eno nakov mashvile. Say for according to Reb Shimon, an otzitz nakov, a perforated pot, is the same thing as a non-perforated pot. Or minhu raise the kasha. Reb Shimon says, ein bein nakov l'she'eno nakov. There is no distinction between a perforated pot and a non-perforated pot. Ella amid beis, ella lahachshir zuraim bilvad. They both say the only distinction between them is hechsher zuraim, ultimately, again, to allow things to be fit to be makabel tumah. Look at Rashi, lahakshir zeraim, haziruim besocho atzit nakov, eno makabel hechsher l'tumah, v'she'eno nakov makabel hechsher d'talashu. So both sides, listen to this. According to Reb Shimon, the Gemara suggests, the only time Reb Shimon makes a distinction ultimately between an atzitz nakov and atzitz she'eno nakov is only by hechsher zeraim. Both say very simply, an item can only be makabel tumah if it comes in contact with liquid and it's detached from the ground. If an item is attached to the ground, then halacha l'maaseh is not capable of becoming tameh. So ultimately, again, Reb Shimon says as follows: if you have a plant or you have seeds that are in a atzitz nakov, they cannot be makabel tumah because they're considered to be attached to the ground. If they are in an atzitz she'eno nakov, right, a non-perforated flower, they are considered to be detached, and therefore halacha l'maaseh capable of being makabel tumah. The Gemara says, "Amarlei l'chol mili Reb Shimon ketalosh mashvilei." No. So the Gemara says, both say, see over here that Reb Shimon does make a distinction between an atzitz nakov and an atzitz she'eno nakov. To which the Gemara says, one second. Amarlei l'chol mili Reb Shimon ketalosh mashvilei. In reality, Reb Shimon holds that a potted plant is always considered to be detached. And that is true whether the flower pot, whether the pot has a hole, has a perforation, doesn't have a perforation. But this case of hechsher zeraim is different. B'shani le'inyan tumah. So also remember again, this case regarding tumah is different. The Torah rib satara eitzel zeraim. The Rabbi said the Torah goes ahead and literally again, rib satara means speaks about many cases of tara by seed. Shneimar al kol zera zerua asher yizareya. So the pasuk says zera zerua asher yizareya, which literally means any seed that is planted and will be planted tahorhu. So we'll say what the Gemara understands over here, Reb Shimon is saying is as follows. If you look at Rashi, asher yizareya kederach she'adam motzi lezriya lemeute mechuber kolduhu. So we'll say, Reb Shimon says as follows, that when it comes ultimately again to seeds or to plants and their ability to be makabel tumah, the Torah goes out of its way to add in these additional lashons of planting. So it is only in this case where Reb Shimon makes a distinction between an atzitz nakov and an atzitz she'eno nakov. That an atzitz nakov is considered to be planted in the ground because the Torah here, when it comes to being makabel tumah, adds in these extra words as if to add in additional cases of an item that is considered to be planted in the ground. So what's an additional case of planting that wouldn't apply in other cases? Atzitz nakov. That if you have a plant or you have a seed in a perforated pot, ultimately, again, just for the purposes of tumah or the ability to be makabel tumah, a perforated pot will be considered to be attached to the ground. But in all other cases, Reb Shimon sticks to his guns. He says, no, atzitz nakov, atzitz she'eno nakov, everything is considered to be detached. Boimine, who's Sam Rabbi Zera. Shorish keneged nekev mali am Reb Shimon. So let's listen to this. So there was an old man who asked Rabbi Zera the following shaila. So we'll say, so now what we have is as follows. Leaving aside the case of hechsher zeraim, which means the ability for a plant or for a seed to makabel tumah, Reb Shimon generally holds a potted plant is a potted plant, and there's no distinction whether it's nakov or not nakov, right? The perforation is meaningless. A potted plant is considered to be detached from the ground. Whether it has a hole, doesn't have a hole, irrelevant. Now, there was an old man who came along and asked Rabbi Zera the following question. According to Rabbi Shimon, is there a distinction? Let's say you have a plant. So we'll say, simple case, I have a tomato plant. It's in a pot, in a flower pot. The flower pot has a perforation, and the root of the tomato plant is mamish right opposite the opening, right opposite the perforation. So literally, again, the pot is sitting on the ground. The root of the plant is right by the perforation, which is right opposite the actual ground. So what would Rabbi Shimon say in a case like that? Would Rabbi Shimon say, listen, a pot is a pot is a pot is a pot, is considered to be detached, and there's nothing more to talk about? Or is there a distinction where the root is mamish right opposite the perforation, and therefore right opposite the actual soil of the earth? So the Gemara says as follows: Mali Reb Shimon, Rashi says, Mi moda dohamechuberhu. Would Rabbi Shimon agree that in that kind of case, maybe we would say that the plant is considered to be attached to the actual earth, since the root is opposite the perforation and therefore pointing directly down at the earth. So Rabbi Zera didn't say anything. He didn't say anything, which was like he didn't know. He didn't say anything. Listen to this. I'm sorry. Another time, so he found him and he was saying as follows. So another time he found him, that ultimately Reb Shimon holds as follows. That if halach l'maisa is very interesting. Look at Rashi. Nikei b'chdei taraso miboy. So the Gemara says, Rashi says over here, Shem Nikev ha'otis b'chdei taraso. Shem nitma nitar b'shvirazu v'hainu kimotzi zayis. Well, let's listen to this. We're going to get into this in a little bit later, but the Gemara says as follows. We know, both said that all kalim, utensils in general, if they break enough or become perforated enough, they lose their identity as a utensil. So this actually has many ramifications. It could have ramification, for example, legabe tuma. So, for example, if you have a utensil that is tamei, but then it develops a hole, and the hole is large enough that it renders it unusable, it loses its tuma status. So Rabbi Shimon says as follows: Shemnike bichdei taraso, that if you have a utensil that has a hole that is large enough to remove the tuma status of the utensil, that ultimately what? Rabbi Shimon holds in that case, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Shimon would agree that in that case, the contents of the kli are considered to be attached to the ground. So once you hear this, Rabbi Shimon says that if you have a utensil that has such a big hole, that hole would take away its utensil status vis-a-vis tuma, that's a big enough hole to also allow the contents of the pot to be considered to be attached to the ground. So the Gemara says, Amar lei, hashta, shoresh keneged nekev boy minach v'lo amrit li v'lo midi. Now when I asked you about the case of what? Of the root that's opposite the hole, you had no answer for me. Nike bichdei taloso mi boy. So we'll say ultimately again, if the because the hole, and yet you take it as a simple idea. You accept this idea that if the utensil has a large enough hole to render it tamei, there's no question about it. Look at Rashi's moment. Nike bichdei taloso mi boy. The habilon l'sapuke bei bahanach. The love keneged. So we'll say, listen to this. So this Saba, this old man, is challenging Rabbi Zera. So remember, just to follow the flow over here, the old man asks Rabbi Zera like this. Here's my shaila. Rabbi Shimon holds that a potted plant is always considered to be detached. Here's my question. What happens if the pot has a hole and the hole is opposite the root? Rabbi Zera says, I don't know. Then Rabbi Zera is giving a shir. The old man is in attendance. And Rabbi Zera says, Rabbi Shimon agrees that if the pot has such a big hole that for Hilchos Tumah purposes, that hole would cause it to lose its designation as a kli and therefore become tahar, that ultimately, again, the contents of the kli are considered to be attached to the ground. So the old man says, I don't understand you. The question, you didn't know how to answer my question, but my question is even stronger. And as Rabbi said, remember, in the statement that Rabbi Zera made, according to Rabbi Shimon, you could have a pot, you could have a utensil that has such a large hole that takes away its tumah status, but the hole could be on the side. And yet you're telling me that in that case, Rabbi Shimon would agree that since the hole is so large, the contents of the pot are considered to be attached. Well, if that case works, then certainly the case that I asked you, where the hole is mamish on the bottom, opposite the root, should certainly allow the plant to be attached to the ground as well. Amar Abaye, V'i itmar lahad Rabbi Zera, haki avad itmar. And Abaye says the truth. If you want to respond to Rabbi Zera, here's have to respond. Umod Rabbi Shimon, Shem Nikev Lamata Miravias. So Rabbi said the Gemara here qualifies the statement that ultimately, again, when is it that Rabbi Shimon says that if the utensil develops a hole that is large enough to take away its tumah status? So also remember again, if a kli is tamei, if it develops a hole that essentially renders it unfit for use, that takes away its tumah status as well. The Gemara suggests that for Rabbi Shimon that has another ramification. Once the kli loses its status as a kli for tumah purposes, the contents of the kli are considered to be attached to the ground. Abai qualifies that and says, when is that true? That's only if the hole is on the bottom of the utensil. So far down at the bottom of the utensil, that's what? that the utensil itself would not be able to retain a revius of liquid. It's in that case that Rabbi Shimon says that if the utensil develops a hole that is so big enough to take away tumah, i.e. it loses its designation as a clean, that the contents are considered to be attached to the ground, but that's only mamish if the hole is where? All the way on the bottom of the utensil. Okay, so Amar Rava. Rava said as follows. Chamish midos bekli cheres. Rava said it's actually very interesting. There are 5 different categories when it comes to a kli cheres, when it comes to an earthenware utensil. So we'll say 5 different categories. And we'll say we'll stop over here. We'll pick up Emirtz Hashem with Amar Rava tomorrow. The 5 different categories of utensils. Yasher Koyach, I say an incredible schus, beautiful daf. So tomorrow actually we'll get into all the different categories. We'll also finish Emirtz Hashem the Perek. Shkayach everyone. We'll stop over here. So again, for those of you who are joining us from the shul parking lots for the Zoom minyan, Emirtz Hashem, we're going to end this Zoom room and I'll restart it a couple of minutes before 7. Shkayach everyone.